Danylchuk has been creating a war diary since the early days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. Anna aims to tell the truth about Ukraine and Russia's war and cut through the noise and propaganda. She's passionate about the beauty and independence of her country and communicates this powerfully in her videos in a clear and honest way. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. If you enjoy the materials we create, please like and subscribe. It really does help to grow the channel. And do please consider supporting our work and the work of Anna on her channel as well by becoming a patron or buy us a coffee. Now, this is my fifth conversation with Anna. This is the first time I've spoken with anybody 5 times. This is an incredibly exciting moment. It's also the second in the series of monthly conversations that I'll be having with influential YouTubers and experts on Ukraine and Russia. Anna, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I am really happy to be here for the 5th time, as you have just counted, and I think I can consider myself a friend of a channel and yours, which is definitely one of the really good things that YouTube gives us.
Absolutely. And I think the bit I love most is it's great speaking to people online, but when you actually meet them in real life, that is tremendous. And of course, in August, we had the privilege of actually meeting at the event we were running in Lviv, and there's now been a little bit of distance between that moment and now. And there's some other impressions we can talk about. You've just come back from Ireland and Poland. I know you've produced a video on your impressions, but I'd love to hear a little bit about how that went.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I also return in my thoughts and ideas to the event that you organized in Lviv this August. And once again, I want to stress that such offline events in Ukraine, of course, they pose some danger on people who visit the country, but at the same time, they are very symbolic and they are very meaningful for the support of Ukraine as an independent country, of Ukraine as a player of this global political field, and that is very important for us in these challenging times. Yes, I had 2 brief work trips to Ireland and to Poland. I enjoyed the experience very much. In both countries, we felt the support and understanding. And of course, it's really easy and inspiring to work and travel in such environments. But what I definitely feel is that the level of my Ukrainian anxiety is higher when I am outside the country. Many of us discuss this because it is a weird, I don't know, psychological trick or something. But you do have this a fake feeling of control that you can change something when you're inside the country. And in one of my vlogs, I compared that to a feeling when you leave your sick relative and you are going on a party and you don't enjoy this party because you think about a person and that you might be of help at the moment. So that's the feeling that we get, and you become more worried about air raid alerts or some news. And I felt like this desire to return back home. In general, the support is very strong. And once again, all Ukrainians are super grateful for this moral, financial, military experience support that we have. Of course, some people feel weird when they learn that you're from Ukraine and you're returning back to Ukraine, because many have this association with Ukrainians abroad as refugees, but not all of us are refugees. Like, the majority stayed in Ukraine, and I had little conversations when people were persuading me not to come back or other things. This is very sweet. I do understand they care, but from the other point of view, we have to protect the country, and protection comes in different forms. Of course, the greatest and the most heroic one is on the front lines, but also my presence in my country, that my place at work, my place in the supermarket, my place even in the cafe is occupied by me. I'm present is also very meaningful. So,
and that's an interesting point. I mean, this almost label it sort of you call it anxiety, but it's perhaps also a certain sense of guilt if you're not subject to air raids and so on. Would you classify it as guilt, or?
I would not describe it as guilt. No, I'm like, I consider myself a pretty psychologically stable person despite various difficult situations I've been in recently. Sometimes I think that this constant stress, it trains us. Some people, it just like you don't have a choice. And when your brain realizes you don't have a choice, you stop this. So for me, it's a feeling of responsibility. It's not the feeling of guilt. I am okay when I feel fine in Ukraine. Of course, the background of war is always present. That's what we encounter. We worry about our people. We are under constant threat. There are lots of things we cannot predict. But if I feel fine at the moment, if I enjoy, I don't know, something, I don't feel guilt, because that's one of the survival mechanisms. If we are very depressed, we will not be able to fight back. And there are lots of beautiful videos from the trenches where soldiers are laughing, where soldiers are filming TikTok videos. And I think it's an important part of Ukrainian resilience, and we have to remain like that. But it's a feeling of responsibility, like you are not doing what you are supposed to do. And for me, it's not guilt. I do let myself enjoy Guinness in Ireland. That's okay. That's normal. That might give me a boost of energy, but I try to focus on my country. For example, I have recently become an entrepreneur, and I have these opportunities to do it, for example, in Poland, but I want to do it in Ukraine to support my country with taxes. I'm not looking for my personal benefits. And yesterday, when going to sleep, I listened to one interview, an interesting one, and I've heard this comparison of people who are like Ukrainians inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. And so those are, in Ukrainian language, it sounds more like precise, more vivid, I'd say. But the word was like, being in Ukraine, you are a participant of this war, even if you are not at the front lines, but you are in this huge army. You are supporting Ukraine's legal status, Ukraine as a country, Ukraine as an economy, Ukraine as a healthcare, educational system, and so on. And when you're outside, you are more of the observer. And the function of the observer is not for me, especially in this like challenging times for my country. And one more thing that I will wind up my long answer with, and I repeat that to my viewers too. Love to your country is real. It is, because for centuries, many people, especially who live in safe environments, they think it's poetry, it's art, it's in the anthem. No, it's a very real feeling. And when your country is hurt, you feel hurt too. It's very real, even if it's not physical. And now I realize, and millions of Ukrainians realize, it's not a psychological construct. It's just like, your family love is real, your love to your children is real, your love to your country is present. And even if you don't like practice it, feeling it daily, it will come to you, especially in such decisive moments of history.
And this abstract concept of freedom as well, I think is an interesting one, isn't it? Because if you come from a place where that freedom is under threat, where parts of your country have an absence of freedom, it can seem like a fairly abstract concept. But then you start to put sort of flesh on the bones. You start to talk about the incidents of abduction, torture, suppression of voices in, say, Eastern occupied Ukraine. So you can sort of make it real in a sense, or intellectually real, by examining particular cases. This idea of love of country being difficult to define but tangible, do you also think this sense of freedom is tangible when you sort of come abroad, or in particular places, for instance, like Ireland?
I think that in terms of the understanding of freedom, Ukraine has joined the Western democratic world long ago. Somehow, I don't know. I'm not an anthropologist, not a historian, but it seems to me this is a built-in quality. of Ukraine. I don't know how to explain that. An interesting observation is that this absence of freedom actually always comes with Russia. And if we look deeper into Russian population, we will see this lack of freedom inside their country, and that is one of their top export products, more than gas and oil. And what is inherently wrong, that absence of freedom is treated as normal in Russian society, and they actually fight against freedom, treating it as lack of control, chaos. Well, they describe democracy as something negative. And this is a very perverted society. So for those who think that like all Russians are suppressed, come on, when Ukrainians are suppressed, when other nations who love democracy and freedom are suppressed, they react, because this kind of life is not life for them. We cannot accept Russian occupation because we don't want to live that way. And those people who say, well, you have to negotiate, you can give up to save people's lives. No, if we give up, we will lose all of our country, all of our lives. And looking back in Ukrainian history, you will see we were always fighting for freedom. We were always free in our minds and words, and that's a healthy part of our society. Being able to tell jokes about your president, being able to change your government if you don't like the direction in which they are moving, even if it costs you something. This is an investment. And believe me, those who give up and agree, they lose more. You know, there is one argument that liberal Russians like to use. They say that we do not protest because we can get killed. Soon, 300,000 Russians will be killed on the battlefields of Ukraine for no reason, apart from a possibility to loot or something. 300,000 people have already sacrificed their lives, and you still say it might be dangerous if we start protesting. But somehow I don't see any samples of civil society in Russia when people try to connect. This is a Ukrainian's survival mechanism. We build our connections, we shape communities, then we demonstrate this unity on different levels, and this is what helps us fight for freedom both inside Ukraine when we had political challenges and now when we fight with Russia. So it is, we have one saying, I'm not sure I will be able to translate it, but when we don't like something in our politics, when we see some grasp of control, I'm not just talking about this moment, everything is more or less healthier, but we have this like small Russia will never win big Russia. So we don't have to be this small Russia with corruption, oligarchy, lack of freedom, lack of like total suppression, subordination. That's the way we will lose if we are just the same. But if we're free, if we're open, if we're strong, if we're united, then we have good chances to actually stop Russia and reshape it in future with the help of our allies, of course.
That's a fantastic sort of way of getting onto a topic I want to address here, which we were talking about before we hit record. And this idea of freedom, I think it's very intimately associated with truth and authenticity, and which isn't to say that these are universal, you know, in any society. It seems to me there's a constant struggle between people who are trying to subvert a system for their own interests, who are using inauthentic politics, inauthentic language, inauthentic ideas, or ideas they don't believe in, but they weaponize them and use them for their interests. This sort of happens everywhere. Russia, of course, is an Olympic expert at this. You know, it's a feature rather than a bug. But that's not to say, you know, that everything's perfect. Ukraine is struggling to try and remove these issues which exist in every society, but also there's a sort of veneer of Russification, isn't there? We were talking about oligarchy, we were talking about inauthentic politics, we were talking about sort of puppet politicians who are created for a particular purpose. It's still an ongoing struggle, isn't it, to fight for authenticity, freedom and truth, and to shake off some of these behaviors which are inherited from the Soviet Union. Let's strip away the term Soviet Union from Russia values, Russian techniques.
Yes, one of my friends says that Russia is the mother of corruption. And I agree, because many things actually broke when Soviet Union was trying to reach communism, and it turned out to be unreachable, and people lost their private property. It was supposed to be that everyone is equal, but there were people who were definitely more equal than others, and political leaders were various, like institutional leaders, having huge assets. It was all tolerated by Soviet society that was very totalitarian, and people did not discuss things. And it was built in Russian national character. Also, they like dig deep into history, trying to hijack Ukrainian Kiev Rus history, forgetting that they were very much influenced by Mongolian Hordes invasion, and this approach to getting wealth by taking, not by generating it, not by creating, but by taking. And it all continued. And after the collapse of Soviet Union, there were criminal 90s. I don't remember much about this time, but I do remember it was a dangerous time. And many people who were not the best, who were not the smartest, were stealing, buying infrastructure objects, serious factories and plants, and pretty well they turned into oligarchs. But all of that came from Moscow. That's why most of the oligarchs that are present in ex-Soviet countries like Ukraine, Moldova, I don't know, they always have connection to the center. That's why the majority of pro-oligarch parties, they were always pro-Russian, because that was the center. That was where they had their trade with and so on. So they were not taking care of national interests, but they were taking care of their money. What is also a problem, European integration of Ukraine or Georgia was a threat to them, because it meant more and more transparency in everything, reforms. And that is why actually many of our societies dreamt about EU integration. It is not about just this image, or you will get more money or something else. Many wanted stronger institutions to come and to stop this influence from Russia, to stop this influence from oligarchy. That's why we always defended that on the Orange Revolution, and the Revolution of Dignity was all about that. So it's not about this fancy dream of a place where you get more money, or the system of healthcare is better. No, it's very realistic understanding that we have to fight these oligarchs by ourselves, but we also need external help, because the system is like an octopus, and it comes from Moscow, and when they want money, they find all the ways to get that. What is also different, starting from the 90s and in 2000s, in Ukraine, people always talked about these people, and they always talked about these people dead. We don't like having hosts. We don't like having, I don't know, nukes. I mean, there's like not real people who believe they can buy everything. And though they were able to get some TV stations, some newspapers, typically it was not okay to demonstrate that you support them or to make photos with them. And in Russia, it's a country. They are proud of being like present on that parties, or I don't know, they have totally different approach. And there are lots of, Navalny had this investigation on Putin's house and other stuff, and it's something unusual for Russia. In Ukraine, in every region, you will have lots of news and updates on people who we consider maybe not even oligarchs, because that's not that many people can be officially called oligarchs, but people who are rich, and we think it's not the correct way. So our society always hated that. Maybe there were courts that need to be reformed. We have a reform of police system, but in general, the attitude of the Ukrainian societies, we hate them. We want them out. We want to take them to court. We want them in prison and so on. And that's what you will hear on the streets, in the newspapers, elsewhere. And if I say it, no one will kill me. And in Russia, it's the country. People like it. People consider them like heroes. This comes from Ords and so on. So this is a totally different culture. And even those who try to legitimize Russia right now, they say nothing about Russian internal politics, because I don't know if there is one. It's just about sharing the resources and supporting the gang. So I would not. Russia uses this narrative that Ukraine is super corrupt to weaken the Western support. Well, of course, we are a country that fights corruption, but focus should be fights. On the word fights. We're doing that really actively, and I don't think that corruption is a problem for many countries. It's something that exists in human nature, but it's really good when countries are fighting, and Ukraine fights corruption together with Russia. Russia does not fight corruption, it encourages it, and no one discusses this on the global arena apart from military aggression, the corrupt essence.
And there's a tendency, isn't there, to turn all these things into abstractions, just as there is sort of, as we'll have seen on social media and so on, there's a tendency as well in academia also to abstract problems out, create distance between them. One classic one would, of course, be to say, well, this isn't an imperial war, it's to do with NATO, and use these big kind of, geopolitical concepts to abstract away from reality. I think what you're talking about here is far more interesting. It's getting down to the individual units, individual people, how they behave, how they think, and then how that coalesces into something more. It aggregates together into some sort of, wider behavior. And there's a very important thing here. One is how you treat people with power and wealth, and whether wealth brings power or power brings wealth. I think there's a key distinction. We talked about that on the video we talked about Russia, that, in the West, you have wealth, and that derives power, derives from that, etc. And then you try to accumulate more wealth because it increases your power. In Russia, quite the reverse. As an extraction economy, you become powerful, and wealth is just part of the privilege of being powerful. But there's an individual psychology as well, isn't there? Either you challenge those power structures, you feel morally uncomfortable with them, as you've been talking about, you judge them. You may not be able to get rid of them, but you judge them, you don't like them.
You mock them. You talk
you
about
mock them, exactly. You agitate to try and change things, but you have contempt. That's a sort of fabric of social values, which is important. Whereas in Russia, you may fear the oligarchs. You may not have total respect for it. You may tell stories about how they got there and how many murders they had to commit or commission to get there. So you will have a web of rumor and speculation. But in essence, not only fear, you have this curious thing, which is sort of respect for the powerful. They attain almost like a holy, untouchable aura. That doesn't exist, you say, in Ukraine. Is that a different point of psychology now?
Yes, I'd say it is very typical for Ukrainians to demonstrate this respect to their politicians, for example, or oligarchs. And actually, Zelensky's party that got the majority in the parliament, it is named the servant of the people. And one of the main messages that they were spreading during the campaign was that they understand that all the deputies, all the ministers, all the people, they are servants of the people, not the hosts of the people. And that is what Ukrainian society likes. Feeling that of equality, feeling of that fact that you have an opportunity to change something in your life, and it's not because someone will allow you to. And we, all our like national heroes, all of our literary characters that are main and central to Ukraine, these are freedom fighters. There is a very sensitive topic about Russian culture, and Russia tries to use it as one of the arguments to legitimize its crimes in Ukraine, or to distract attention from terrorism, and saying that, well, we have ballet, but we have literature. And the fact is, much of this culture is a propaganda construct, because like the modern Russian culture, no one likes, no one watches in the world, I mean, globally, Russian movies or modern Russian books. They use this brief spell of the end of the 18th century and 19th century, actually not longer, to use like to get sentiments from people. But even if you look, every nation has its main poet, right? And even if you compare Shevchenko, who is our Ukrainian poet, he always spoke about freedom, about wrong choices made in history. He supported, for example, American Revolution, all democratic tendencies, respect to people, diversity even. You will find that in his text. And when you look at Pushkin, that is a very imperial poet. Some of his poems are dedicated to the beauty of nature, winter, blah, 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 which is not interesting now. Like it's good. It's universal. You can speak about nature, Russian winter, and so on. But all of his serious works that include some history of politics, they are glorification of Russian tsars and glorification of Russian imperial policy and denial that peoples of the Caucasus or Poles are people. So you will see that actually, if you look deeper into the messages that these two people were sending like centuries ago, they were different. They were very different. And nothing changed. Ukraine remains pro-democratic and free country, and Russia remains a totalitarian, loving, authoritarian country.
And coming to the theme again of authenticity and lies, there seems to be a different way in which those are processed in those societies, which again isn't to say that we don't have lies in Western politics. We absolutely do. I strongly believe that many of those who orchestrated Brexit, and this isn't a slur on people who voted for it, I think many people genuinely believed what they were voting for, but many of those, I think, who orchestrated Brexit did not believe in the things they were saying. Inauthentic ideas that are weaponized. And here you see in politics, it's a battle, I think, between authenticity and fabrication. It's between self-interest and societal interest. It doesn't go away. It's continuous. And, if you don't join that battle, then you'll lose your democracy. There seems to be a far greater sway, a far greater universality of lies in the functioning of Russian society, not just its political establishment. And there seems to be a certain acceptance of historical mythology, of lying as something that is, I would say, far more acceptable. In fact, something that is embraced almost daily. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or whether there's more complexity behind that. I know Peter Pomerantsev talks about, the ability, especially instilled by the Soviet system, of believing highly contradictory things. So perhaps a lie isn't a lie; it can coexist with a reality and whatever. But what's your view on the I would call it the tyranny of lies within Russian society?
Now, I don't want to victimize Russian society because that's what many are trying to do. There are two wars that happen. One is this brutal, aggressive, violent war that is physically present. But there is also a long-term background imperial war that Russia has against many of the countries that were unlucky to be a part of its empire, Soviet Union. And that one is very cunning or shrewd, what would be the correct word? Because if we, for example, win this victory, win this war, Russia leaves, it is still a very great danger. Then even Russian oppositioners like Navalny will continue their imperial narratives. And imperial narratives are really good background for future special military operations or other stuff. Russians continue seeing us as brotherly nations, for example, even good Russians. Come on, what brothers? And especially an elder brother. Nations are not brothers. They can be friends, allies, but stop using this family subordination concept. Or the thing that Russian is the language of Ukraine. Ukraine was Russified. Yes, now for many people it was their language. But the result of it, not their free choice, but colonial or imperial, you can choose any policy that was applied for centuries on these territories, taking away our cultural identity and substituting it, demonstrating Ukrainians are stupid, primitive, only peasants and other stuff, destroying our writers in the 30s, for example. That's a huge topic. I want to record a video on, like, executed Renaissance. These people were fantastic. You would love, you bought the book of one of them, I know, when in Lviv. But I imagine how different my country would have been if these people continued creating. They ruined a lot, physically, not just morally, and it continues, and it's very dangerous that Russia will continue doing that. Okay, they will stop targeting us with missiles. Putin will be in The Hague, for example, and the new Navalny comes. And he continues saying that you are a smaller brother, you have to speak Russian, Russian history is that way, and Pushkin is more important than your national. And that's a tragedy, that's a total danger. And lies, this substitution of history, substitution, social engineering, is something that Russia actively practices. And their people consider lies normal. You pretty well know that in many countries that reached a certain level of democracy, at work, at school, it's really difficult to shut people's mouths, and that's important. That's the way it should be. And in Russia, people prefer not to say something, and it happens for centuries. And the problem is that it turned out to be their feature already. And when not only they remain silent by themselves, they start hating those who speak. And in Ukraine, sometimes when a strike happens or something, people are looking for a speaker, people are cheering him and so on. And in Russia, they are trying to silence the one who is eager to say. And maybe that it is, like, once again, I began with this victimization of Russians. So the liberal good Russians, they are trying to create image or future that Russia is also a victim, people are victims, and they should be treated just as Ukrainians. I will not be surprised if some very, very tolerant institutions, global institutions, after this victory and fall of Putin's regime, will do their best to equate Ukrainian and Russian people, which will be totally wrong, and that will be an investment in future wars and conflicts, because no one had an idea to say that people in Germany were victimized by Nazis. Okay, of course, not all people were Nazis in Germany in times of Nazi, but they were not like victims. They cannot be equated to people who were physically killed, whose culture was under threat, and so on. And I'm very much afraid, and I see symptoms of that. So they are trying to demonstrate their trauma. They are victims of Putin. They cannot do anything. Like 140 million people, they cannot do anything against a group of criminals, pretty old and not in a good physical shape.
I mean, people might listen to that. People might listen to that and struggle to understand that idea or to agree with it. I can say categorically, I have friends who I've spoken to, people I knew or know from Russia, people who are from liberal circles, so-called, people who have despised Putin since the day he came to power. What you say is absolutely true. And I'll, word for word quote what I consider an incredibly sensitive, cultured, intelligent person to have said. This is a person who was arrested for protesting in the early weeks of the war and ended up in CISO. And this is a person who's not young, who has a family and so on, and took great personal risk. And yet, came out with the phrase, and this is already when missiles are raining down on Kiev. They said, it's bad for Ukrainians, but at the end of the day, this is going to be far worse for us. And you're like, what? I mean, literally, what are you talking about?
I am very much afraid that the world now is too kind in comparison to the world in the 40s. And it will not be able to take an ordinary, neutral Russian and point him or her at the sins that were committed with the help of his silence. They will not organize excursions to Mariupol. There were reactions when there were some beautiful destruction on the Kerch Bridge, and some of Russian tourists had to leave Crimea through the territories close to Mariupol. And there were lots of feedback from these good Russians that they dislike traveling through this area because it causes depression, and it's like very negative experience. And they do not, they don't even think that this is what happened, this is what you did. And they don't have this feeling of responsibility. We have the feeling of responsibility for our country, and they don't. And I think the very first thing for future forgiveness or any kind of legitimization is actually the understanding of that guilt. And what Pope is trying to do, this thing is possible after many years, and when the aggressor opens its eyes and says, yes, we did that. That's our sin. That's our guilt. We have to work with that. There were some reasons, but we are guilty of that. Of course, Ukraine did not deserve that. And we've committed many crimes, and they don't want to do it. And pretty well, they're trying to victimize themselves. So I'm trying to answer your question about the lies. The thing is that, once again, I don't want to speak about Russians as victims, but I do see them as very traumatized. This is one of the things that many Ukrainians realized when this war started, especially those who were neutral to Russia, who believed in this brotherly nation narrative, who were speaking Russian, who were very much under the influence of Ruski Mir and so on. They opened their eyes. They saw missiles ruining universities and hospitals. They talked to their friends and relatives who denied, no, you're lying, no, there are such things, and so on. And these Russians, in personal conversations, they have a choice to believe that, but they choose not to. And they aggressively stop this conversation, which shows that they are deeply traumatized. And they treat truth as something not just dangerous for them. It was maybe in the 50s when Stalin, or in the 30s, but they treat it as something that irritates them. They hate it. They don't want it. And they try to manipulate and substitute and say something like, so your truth led to the deaths of millions, or that. No, it's not the truth. It's you, Russia, who led to the deaths of Ukrainians. It's not the truth. It's your problem with reality. Perhaps this will kill them because Russia believed in its own propaganda. They were manipulating, they were brainwashing, and Putin believed he can have his blitzkrieg and take Kyiv in 3 days. And he still believes many of the myths of that propaganda that the world also believed, because they are the first army in the world in the field of propaganda. I have to agree. Their informational war, hackers, attacks, messages, they are super professional. And they deceived themselves. This often happens. This always happens with those who overdose with propaganda. And they will become victims of it. But at what price?
I think there's an interesting concept as well. Again, there's a risk that people will try to abstract this out and they'll talk about geopolitics and so on. But what you're describing here is a very personal process, individual trauma, not one to admit any guilt or responsibility. I think one of the connections here, of course, is that Russians have almost no agency in their lives. They know it. They have no power. They have no ability to influence power. Often they will have a complete disinterest in being involved in politics. It's dirty. It's considered immoral, beneath them, boring, etc. But they know they have no power to change and influence their own lives. Therefore, when you ask of them guilt, when you ask of them responsibility for their actions, it triggers that deep understanding they have no power in their own lives. And I think that's one of the reasons why that reaction is so strong. Another reason, and it's an interesting one, I think, is envy. And I wanted to unpack this idea of agency, but also envy. If you go back to the sort of 16th, 17th century, 18th century, and you read the accounts of travelers, foreign travelers through Russia, it's not that it's just the authorities that try to create a Potemkin facade or an illusion. It's every single person. And this happened to me a lot when I was there. You'd be having a drink, you'd be talking to people, they'd start to discuss their problems, because Russians, whatever their other qualities, are generally not stupid, and we don't want to label them as such. Many of them are fully aware.
There are no generally stupid people.
Well, but they are aware of many of their problems. It's not that they live in this extremely traumatized, problematic society where so many things don't work. A lot of people are fully aware that that is not how other countries function. They're aware that things don't work in the way they should. And they feel a deep sense of envy. But also, when I'm in these groups, so many times people would say, oh, hang on a second. And they're talking in Russian. Let's not discuss these problems because there's a foreigner present. Or he shouldn't hear this, or etc. And they try to dampen down essentially truthful conversations, because I think of a variety of reasons, but one of them is a sort of envy mixed with an inferiority complex. And partly what we're seeing here in the invasion of Ukraine is that writ large on a large scale. Why should Ukrainians have these nice things and we don't? Why should they have a better functioning society and we don't? I mean, who are they to think they're better than we are?
It is very difficult to pretend that you are great if the only great thing that you possess is your territory. Russia does not have great literature at the moment, great cinema, great music, great economy, great healthcare system, great education. I don't see thousands of migrants reaching the shores of some Moscow ports. It is not a popular place of immigration. It does not give you many opportunities, and it is decaying. Its dig and sell economy is not competitive in the 21st century. They are using old infrastructure, old Soviet weapons, old Soviet messages adapted to new realities. They are living in the past. You cannot be competitive when you are living in the past. That's why they are hiding everything, because some connection that they have to reality shows them some dissonance, like same as this poor Russian orc soldiers who visit ruined Ukrainian houses and are surprised the way people live, the way people eat, the way people dress. For an attentive observer, this would reveal a huge national tragedy of Russia. Imagine the soldier traveling to an ordinary Ukrainian flats, because flats in Bucha and Irpin, these are not super well-off people. This is not, an expensive district of any capital has. This is an average Ukrainian middle-class family that wears normal sneakers, eats Nutella. We can afford that. We could not in the 90s. I remember how I was asking my parents to buy me Nutella and persuaded them we need this glass that remains after Nutella. And they did not buy me it, not because of health issues, but because it was 10% of their salary. And you still have a month ahead. But we were developing, evolving, we were talking about that. So for them, you would not be surprised with the flats in Bucha, but they were. And it's a tragedy because they come as conquerors, but they are poorer than people they want to conquer, which actually goes against this imperial. It's very complicated to speak about. I don't support the idea of Ukraine as former Russian colony, because first of all, we accidentally gave birth to Moscow as Kiev Rus. So I believe colonies cannot give birth to the empires. And also we are the level of our social institutions, our political culture, and our economy was higher in the beginning of the 20th century. It is now. More people want to come and live in Ukraine even during wartime than they want to in Russia, with this image of a super strong country. So this is what we observe, and they try to continue developing this myth, but they are not real. What is a great problem? That Russians do hate everything alien, everything foreign, everything they don't know. And the majority of European nations, they learn from each other, they exchange. Of course, there are things we won't like about you, you won't like about us, but that's part of normal process of communication. But we're open to learn from you, you can learn something from us, and together we will be stronger. And Russia has a different concept. They don't want to learn, they want to erase, to destroy, and feel good. But one more question that you often raise in your videos, and I'm very grateful for that, and also in conversations, is they don't like, okay, Ukrainians have been in the situations when we have bad government like Yanukovych. There is nothing that we can do at the moment, but we continue working on this very personal level. When you make the environment around you better, your flat, then you start with your house, then you continue with your street, then you start working, you find people and you start working on your city. That's the way it works. And when you travel Ukrainian villages, you see beautiful fences, not really high, you see trees, you see people may not be rich, but they're trying to do their best with their local environment. And in Russia, this devastation takes place even in a village that could have been nice. apolitical but nice, but they don't choose it.
And that's interesting because I think, the trip to Lviv, there's so many impressions. First of all, fortunately, it validated a lot of things that the channel's fighting for. And, I wanted to go there and check that actually, that we're saying the right things, that we're actually reflecting a reality. And these views aren't just a sort of giant Potemkin facade, a giant lie. And they're not. It went there, and actually, Lviv was so much more than I was expecting, and not just in terms of a beautiful ancient European city, but the care, attention that people pay to restoring it. The care and attention people pay to its history and the stories they were telling about it, and the clear taste. It's not being restored in a tacky, tasteless way, which shows a great amount of thought and planning and so on. So that was very impressive. But what was really impressive was the countryside. And as you say, it's these little details where you go through a village, and I didn't see any litter or mess on the sides of the roads. Now, here in Oxford, I could drive through the country lanes, and it's not half as tidy here as it was in Lviv. Here you see people throw their rubbish out sometimes, people passing through from a different area, and it makes me very angry. I didn't see any of that. Of course, there are ruined buildings from history and whatever, and there are things that need to be fixed, but you had cottages and houses in the countryside, some a little bit poorer, some a little bit richer, some have got a little bit more care and attention than others. You have a variety, but they're all a similar height, all a similar sort of shape. There's no one who is clearly far richer than somebody else, or more importantly, who wants to project the impression of being far superior or richer. None of the houses were surrounded by 6-foot walls. You didn't have these little mini Kremlins that you see throughout the Russian countryside. You get a sense of much more equality or equity, and the desire not to appear different, not to appear superior, greedy, whatever it happens to be. And very few abandoned houses. Now, some obviously, are between owners, some are falling into decay, but it felt like quite an organic process, and those were sort of fairly normal. If you go through the Russian countryside, you find many, many abandoned properties, often half-built. Construction has started and then been abandoned. And you have to ask, why is that? Often people will acquire wealth suddenly and they'll want to spend it quickly, and then it'll run out. Or their ambitions, their envy, their sense of wanting to project some kind of status or superiority in society is far beyond their means, far beyond their ability to actually build in the real world. And a very instructive story, we're in a village visiting some friends, and you have these little plots of land. I think they're about sort of 15 or 20 meter by 20 meter plots of land, and normally someone will build a house in the middle, and they'll have a little garden around it. They'll give space, whatever, to be able to put some benches or trees, or the outside toilet. The outside toilet as well. You've got to make space for that. But this particular man, obviously consumed by envy, decided to build a house that literally occupied the entire plot. It was like a mansion built inside a tiny little space of land. And, he got halfway up to the second floor. Apparently, at the end of every week, he'd spend his salary, buy some bricks. He'd come, and it's this extraordinary, projection of that status you want to create. Of course, it's absurd, because why would you build it surrounded by lots of little houses? But eventually, this process drove him mad, and apparently, he lost his mind and ran into the woods, and then lived for 6 months in the woods on berries and nuts. This process of his overactive ego sort of drove him insane. And you can laugh at that, but you travel through the countryside, and it's a series of huge houses, tiny houses, ruined houses, abandoned houses. You can see alcoholism writ large because of, the amount of properties that are going to waste and ruin. And yeah, it speaks to a deeply traumatized society. It speaks to a society that is not interested in investing economically or thinking economically about the future. You grab some wealth and you stick it in something so someone can't steal it. But you also, have this overarching sense of status. So that was quite a long, rambling thing. I apologize to the audience. I went on a huge ramble
beautiful.
there.
That's actually very important. It describes a lot. We return back to this concept of private property that I often mention. Many Ukrainians opposed Soviet occupation because they loved their things they possessed. And I'm not talking about wealth. I'm talking about an ordinary house, 2 horses, a cow, a pig, and an orchard. And Russians were so susceptible to the idea of Bolshevism, from my perspective, because they did not have anything. Like, if you do not have anything, like many of your people are very poor and they don't possess anything, of course they are ready not to have private property and to share it all with communas. But if you have something you're able of keeping and growing, you will oppose. And they still did not manage to develop relations with property. That's why they don't believe in this continuality, like when you have something and you pass it to your generations, because it's not real in Russia. And also because if you're successful, some criminals will come and take it away from you. And that's very depressive. I don't know, like, how do you deal with that? Well, of course, you have to fight the corruption. You have to fight this strong authoritarian links that disrespect your freedom, your dignity, your freedom of choice, and they don't understand it and remain like silent people who do not have anything. And Ukrainians, they are trying, despite, like, we are, we can say traumatized Russians, but Ukrainians were more traumatized. They organized Holodomor genocide. They were Russifying us. They were doing lots of things, and now they kill us, hundreds daily. And we are still cleaning our houses, sowing our fields in bulletproof vests. And they don't do it on the territories that are open for everything. So Russia definitely does not need more territories.
It's a different thing, isn't it? If you compare it, I think, to historic evolution of civilization, their approach is more of a slash and burn. You use the land, you burn it, you move on, you take some more. It's a mentality that goes back to the most ancient, almost sort of the stage above the hunter-gatherer, but it's a very ancient mode of living, and a lot of the land, as you say, that exists is not particularly rich land, but it's not even used in any sense. There's vast tracts of Russia which could be generating wealth, which are not. But it's far worse, isn't it? Because there was a class of kulak, there was a class of propertied peasants that was emerging in Russia during the revolution. There was a class of people who were proto-capitalists. You build a farm. What do you do next? You start to build a factory. That process was beginning, but didn't have the underpinnings in law. And then it didn't. That process was still evolving, and then of course it was all swept away. And you hear so many stories when you start drinking with people, and they tell you stories about their grandparents. And in the 90s, I was fascinated by stories from the revolution because you still had that connection of people who spoke to their grandparents who were in the revolution, and they could remember it. And there are a couple of things that really struck me. People would sort of describe the situation in their village or town. And they'd say, oh, well, the person who became the commissar, the person who, became the Bolshevik sort of guy in charge, let's say, and I'm almost always male, of course. Prior to the revolution, they would have been, an alcoholic or someone with a problem or somebody deeply envious of those who you've described who are building something, those who've invested in a farm, maybe employ other people, own their own property. They're looking every day to work towards some kind of future. And what's the word? Nakapi, to accumulate sort of wealth. And the revolution, it seems to me, was a process where those who are envious of people who had that future mindset saw an opportunity to just take it, steal it. And that's, again, a very primitive description of what went on. But when you break it down from these big geopolitical concepts down to what actually happened on the ground, you start to see that there's these sort of personalities at work there, and there's much more individual traumatizing processes at work.
Yes. And, I remember many people who read the history of the revolution. They say that at the very beginning, perhaps even Lenin and co. did not believe they will manage, because that was not a big group of poor, envious, alcoholic people. And perhaps they did not need the resilience of the society. And once again, we see this trouble. They do not shape into societies. They oppose that. And I don't know what's the background for that.
And the other thing you mentioned there is the idea of modernity. You talked about the lost renaissance of Ukraine. We've talked about Kievan Rus as well, and the very ancient history of Ukraine. Ukrainians could clearly, with that lost history, they could clearly fall into a trap of idealizing the past, looking at lost utopia, looking to try to recreate a mythical past. Do you have any sense that that's part of the Ukrainian character, or is it? Because in talking to people, I didn't get any sense that there's this sort of huge nostalgia for the past. There's more of a willingness to try and ensure that the past traumas are not repeated, much more of a sort of forward-looking. But how does that sit? How do you avoid falling into, I would say, a sort of nostalgic longing for lost opportunity?
Well, I think it is a normal physiological work of any brain to be future oriented, because when you are focused on your past, you're not able to change, evolve, or do something. Ukrainians are definitely future oriented. We talk about our history, and we need to talk a lot, and about our glorious history, because Russia was stealing it for centuries. And it's very important for our generations to know the real history and to explain it to the world, who saw Ukraine as a rebellious part of Russia for centuries. So it's very important to return back our cultural, historical heritage. But at the same time, most of our history is a struggle for our independence that we had and we lost. We had and we lost. That's why, personally, I never say that Ukraine is a young country. We do not celebrate 30 years of our independence. We celebrate 30 years of our renewed independence, just as Lithuania does, other countries. We had short spells, longer spells of independence. We had glorious periods like Kiev Rus, but that was 1,000 years ago, more. We realize that's really far away in time. Then there was short spells. They were super important. They invested a lot in future Ukrainian resilience and society. And when I speak to some Belarus people, for example, or others, they say, we did not have this huge movements pro-independence, and maybe that's what leads to the activeness of our society. And that's true. At least they analyze that. But we do not want to repeat the mistakes of the past, when we had this short spell, for example, of independence in 1918, 1922, and other stuff. So we want to learn from these mistakes, because apart from foreign influence, there were internal mistakes, and we try to work on mistakes. But I think it's very logical. I think it is logical to think about future, to try and construct, try and change and evolve in your country. And the question is why Russia does not look into future, why they don't have this mechanism that makes their people, their politicians, think about future, because that's where we are heading. All of us are moving in that direction of future. We cannot return in our past. That's a different country, as you've said. But something is broken, and they are past oriented. I don't know many societies that are past oriented.
Well, you've just been to Britain. Britain, I would have to say, is both a mixture of modernity, but also there is a strong impulse to be nostalgic for a lost past. And unfortunately, the connection, I think, is also nostalgic for an imperial past. I wonder what you think, but I think it's when you become nostalgic for, let's say, an industrial past or a social past or an intellectual past, I think that can be translated into something constructive. When you become nostalgic for an imperial past and projecting power over other people, that is an extremely destructive trend. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I totally agree with you. Of course, all of us feel nostalgic. That's normal. That's a part of human nature, and can be personal nostalgia and can be national nostalgia for this glorious period. But we go out of that, and that is not what shapes our policy. That is not what shapes our educational system. These are moments, these are emotions, these are important thinking stops, like a bus stop, but this is not something that drives us. And I think it's true about your country too. And empires will not survive in the 21st century if everything goes right. And most of the empires, they dissolved in the 19th and the 20th century. Of course, there are some nostalgia, but they do not exist anymore. And Russia is still a dying empire. It dies very hard.
And people don't change. This will be the sort of last question here. And actually, no, we shouldn't end on Russia, because that's the wrong. And I never want to end one of these videos
talking about
Russia.
To end Russia.
Yeah, to end Russia, yes. This is the real challenge, isn't it? You know, if you're German or Japanese and you were to express nostalgia for an imperial past, especially one rooted in the 1930s, you would be told categorically that is wrong, and you cannot think like that, and you cannot feel like that. And you know, which isn't to say, you know, there aren't people who don't think like that, but they're in a small minority, and they're categorically told that is immoral. I think this is the point, coming back to your earlier point about the West being too weak. We are not yet telling Russians that it is wrong to romanticize imperialism. It's wrong to think in a material, in an imperial way. It's wrong to desire to dominate other people. It's immoral. It's unmodern, and you will be punished politically, economically, and socially if you carry on thinking like that. I fear that we're not doing that, and that we will not do that even when the war is over.
I fear that too, because many people globally have chosen this approach that Russia is different and we have to treat it differently. You can hear that about China, for example, or some other countries. Then I get this question: why then we have organizations like United Nations, OSCE, and other stuff that were built to guarantee like equal respect to rights and demands? Of course, people, nations have different cultural heritage, have different diets that they prefer, different music, different concepts of family. But there are some rules that all have to obey, that create this world order, that guarantee future peace and survival of the planet. And when talking about these rules, there are no exceptions. And many treat Russia, well, Russia is wild, Russia is... No, you just let it be that way. It is, many of my viewers compare Russia to a bully at school. Of course, it's not a very ideal comparison, because bully at school typically do not kill people in thousands. but the pattern of behavior is very similar. And we all pretty well know that if we close our eyes and we pretend that nothing happens and he acts just like that because he is just like that, we do worse for our small community and for that person because we don't let him change. The problem is that many people do not want to touch Russia because first they don't want to understand, look deep, get frightened. But still, it's just like with a diagnosis. You can close your eyes. You have to do something if a person is ill. You have to make some operations, apply some medications. You cannot escape, or it's the way to die. Also, that many do not want to interfere and change anything, but maybe look at it from a different perspective. If you're so kind, so tolerant to Russians, help them. They are in great trouble. They are living in a country that turns into North Korea. And it's really big, and it's not okay what happens there. And it is not always that the patient knows he needs help in some cases. And people are afraid of that. People are afraid of thinking in that direction, the same as they are afraid of the collapse of Russia because of nuclear weapons and so on. Well, there was no nuclear war when Soviet Union collapsed, and that was a greater, perhaps, geopolitical change, 75 years and so on. And look at it from a different perspective as a liberation and chance for many new indigenous peoples that are now under the shadow of Russian regime. You will be surprised how diverse and beautiful that territory is. And believe me, Chechnya or Udmurti, they are not Russians. They share different cultural heritage, language, and you'd be surprised how beautiful it is. Why do you care about the diversity, for example, on the European continent, and you don't care about that in some Asian parts of Russia?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And look at it that way. For me, I have accepted, and I feel it's correct, I have accepted that idea that actually Soviet Union, this monster, is still collapsing, is still disseminating, and that's what we witness. These are just his dying seizures. They are dangerous because when falling, it can hurt you. But the process is just like that. So it's just a continuation of the fall of the Soviet Union.
And we ended up, the last segment is unfortunately about Russia, but next time we'll definitely make it about Ukraine.
Okay.
And it'll be interesting to unpack that slow motion collapse, because I'm going to be doing a video next week on Russian economy, on this disintegration, on the descent into the past with the statue of Dzerzhinsky, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the terrifying sort of head of the Russian intelligence service that's been resurrected. And we're going to talk about the sort of historical mythology in Russian publishing. So there's lots of stuff coming up that tries to unpack that. And I think, the point you made there is, if we don't understand it, if we don't have a plan for how it can change, then those bad behaviors will simply repeat. But we've run out of time on this one. It would be great to keep this going. I feel like there are a million things we can explore and talk about. So I look forward to the next one, hopefully in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It means a lot to me as a Ukrainian, and I hope it will be useful for our viewers. And thank you once again for the support that we feel. And together we must return this world to normality. And that means do something with Russia and its population.